lunch and lots of food and drink, if you're of age, wine and beer. And we're really excited about you hanging around and getting to know Michael and talking to Anthony and each other. So this program is co-sponsored by our Real Arts program and also by our Creative Ventures program. And the only other thing I want to say is that this person over here, Anthony DeCurtis, is a superstar in everybody's book, but in my book particularly, because he does this kind of program all the time and has for how many years?
20 years.
20 this year.
Exactly.
20.
Thank you very much.
And we are celebrating Anthony's 20 years of doing these kinds of programs and teaching amazing courses at Alumni Day, which is May, I want to say 12th or something like that, Saturday.
That weekend.
That weekend, at least, maybe the 13th.
Graduation, also secondarily, is happening on Monday, I guess.
It's going to be a DeCurtis Fest, so I just want to give you advance notice. So in advance of this amazing interview that's about to happen, let's thank Anthony DeCurtis for this and 20 years of work.
Thank you.
And I'm going to give this mic to the people in the back, because during Q&A.
Can I?
Yes.
Can I get this? I'd rather stand up to read for the reading part.
Absolutely.
If someone can help me with that.
Do we want to get
Somebody for that?
You can just turn that thing up at any point. You want to give him the wireless? Want to do wireless?
Then I got to hold.
Oh, that's right. Okay. We'll get that set for you. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, we're going to, Michael kind of needs no introduction, really. Obviously, most of you have probably most recently have seen him on the second season of White Lotus. I, however, saw him last night in Williamsburg with his band, Zopa, playing at Baby's All Right, going on at 11 o'clock, and still making it down here successfully. But Michael, as you know, well known for his role on The Sopranos, and now for this novel, and which is quite an extraordinary achievement. I mean, one of the things that is so admirable about him is like the number of different kind of artistic areas that he's kind of willing and able and kind of enjoys exploring. I mean, that kind of that kind of sensibility is, I think, a lot of what the Writer's House is about. Even as it's the Writer's House, we have musicians here and we have actors and other kinds of people of all sorts engaged in creative activities. So this is an absolute high point for me personally and for the Kelly Writer's House. So Michael has agreed to do a little bit of reading, and then we'll chat. The book is called "The Perfume Burned His Eyes."
So I'm gonna read from the end. Oops. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm gonna read the. The book is about a 15-year-old boy who grew up in Queens and moves to Manhattan, kind of a ritzy neighborhood, and very different than the blue-collar kind of working-class place he grew up in. And Lou Reed happens to be his upstairs neighbor. It takes place in the mid-'70s, and Lou's in a particularly drug-fueled period of his life, a creative one, but kind of a crazy one. And the kid strikes up a friendship with him. And then the epilogue, which I'm going to read to you, doesn't really give anything away, because the 15-year-old boy's story ends in a certain way. And then the boy is a man in 2013 in his 50s, kind of looking back on this a little bit. So I'm going to read that last chapter. California, November 2013. I'm heading up the 101 with Los Angeles behind me. I think it's autumn. It's night, so it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell in the daytime, too. The sun has no seasons in Southern California, or maybe it does, and I just haven't figured them out yet. On the edge of Thousand Oaks, I find myself at the top of the Conejo grade. It's a dizzying decline that twists down into the valley where Camarillo begins. If you didn't know any better, you could easily think you were about to fall off the edge of the world. This stretch of Cali freeway is supposedly haunted by the ghost of a hitchhiking migrant farm worker who was run over by a drunken teenager who hung himself in his jail cell, which I suppose makes two ghosts, though it's only the farmhand who's been seen in these parts. And though I have no idea where in the Los Angeles area my father crashed and burned, something in my gut tells me it was here. I'm sure there are ways to research it, find out the truth, but I have yet to do so, and I probably never will. Sometimes the truth of imagination is easier to live with than the truth of fact. By day, you can see hills rolling on for miles, some of them strange and mysterious, like flat-top pyramids grown over wild, too correct in angle and line to be a product of nature. At night, it's like sitting in the cockpit of an airplane as you slowly descend to a narrow landing strip between the mountains, hills, farmland, and the lights of the Cameroons. Depending on which way the wind is blowing, you might get a heady waft of peaty fertilizer or sugary strawberry if luck is with you. But tonight, the air is still. One of your songs comes on the radio. You are only a few days dead, so a lot of your songs are being sent over the airwaves. It's an old song, one of your earliest, a nugget that would spawn so many more of its kind as an unbroken chain of admirers fell under your influence. It's a tender tune, a sad, slow song, sweet and delicate. Something churns in my solar plexus and threatens release through the eyes. It catches me by surprise, then it breaks and the tears come, big drops that fall out easy. They drip like wax, sealing all the oaths and pledges. It feels good. I go from surprise to shock when I notice it's raining. It hasn't rained here in years, but the sky doesn't know that, so it sends the water down as if it were common. It pours like the tropics, and it's very hard to see. Dangerous. West Coast drivers are unaccustomed to wet roads and impaired visibility. We all slow to a steady creep, some of us crying. I cry as much for your passing as I do for the time unrecoverable that has passed me by. I cry for the boy I was, who became a man, for the city I loved, which has vanished like you have, for the beautiful, brilliant, shooting starlet who left this earth while still a child. I cry for never having known you, once I was old enough to understand who you really were, and the magnitude of the art you made. The story here, closing with me on the edge of manhood, is as much yours as it is mine. Its end is where we parted, and it would be at least 15 years until I'd see you again. I didn't mention who I was, or that we'd met before, because I didn't expect you'd remember or recognize me. You didn't. So I expressed my admiration as a fan. I'm pretty sure it was a post-premiere party for a film, and I'm certain it was at El Teddy's or El Internacional. I don't remember what incarnation the joint was at the time. You were standing at one of the floor-length urinals in the men's room. After following you in, I know, I stood and peed with an empty drain in between us to be polite. Looking straight ahead at the white tile wall, I said, I was listening to you this afternoon. Magic and Loss. It's a masterpiece. You glanced over for a little second, and after assessing if I posed any threat, you turned back to the wall and said kindly, That's pretty cool. Then you zipped up and walked away. A little while later, I was watching you drinking a can of Tecate at the bar. Now, this surprised me because word on the street was that you were anonymously sober. Standing next to my recovering friend, whose guest I was that evening, I pointed out the beer. He shrugged and said, Junkies, man, they have a sobriety all their own. I didn't understand what he meant. By then, you were a long way from junk or speed or whatever it was that possessed you way back when, and to reduce you to junkie, like once a junkie, always a junkie, well, for my friend, I apologize. I was happy to see you sip the beer. It made me see clear the fluid and idiosyncratic possibilities in our lives, or maybe more accurately, the fluidity and idiosyncrasy that is our lives. Made me see that there are escape routes out of hell. And if we are fortunate, we can make a clean getaway and survive. We can survive the fires that started when we kicked the candles in our sleep, too fucked up to remember to blow them out. We survived the fights at dawn where there was nothing left to say but curses, low blow, insults, and the revelations of harbored desires to inflict violence and pain. We survived falling down the stone stairs backward, literally head over heels, because we were so drunk and the last cigarette made us so dizzy. Yes, we were lucky and earned that sip of beer at the bar. The next time I saw you was 10 years after the men's room encounter. You were performing at the second permutation of the Knitting Factory. It was the first April of the new millennium, and you had just released a new album. 4 decades in, and your work was as potent, relevant, and necessary as anyone's, if not more so. I remember thinking as you walked on stage that you were the same age my father would have been, just about 60. It would be the only time I would ever see you perform live, and the last time I would ever be in your presence. What I proceeded to behold that evening was the living embodiment of rock and roll itself, its essence distilled and offered up with generosity and benevolence for all those who gathered to bear witness to the passion, to the majesty, ferocity, and might, the power and the glory transmitted through vibration, gesture, and mind, mantra, mudra, and meditation. From you to us with love and compassion, for we know not what we do. The song ends, and the tears stop as suddenly as they started. Another song of yours begins to play. It's the one that got me into all the trouble. You played it that night at the Knitting Factory, a miracle really, because I loved it so much, and it was rarely included in your live repertoire. It was sheer delight that evening, and maybe even more thrilling tonight. It opens with a wail, your guitar. Then it churns and rumbles, bass and drums. Then melts euphoric, more guitar. Then you shout. It is heroic and brave, transcendent and holy, and it doesn't look like the rain will stop. I hit the gas hard and head into the west.
Well, thank you for that. That was great.
Thank you.
Why don't you talk about writing the novel? What it's kind of a coming of age story.
Yeah.
What made you choose to kind of approach that work that way? Was that the book you always wanted to write, or?
Well, when I started the book was summer of 2013, and my middle child was 16. Going through a lot of 16-year-old stuff. And I wrote the book, and, I was trying to relate to that head, that frame of mind, what it's like to be 16. And I thought maybe that would make things easier, communicating and dealing with him. So I started writing a coming-of-age story, not with Lou Reed, but it was in New York. It was in the mid-'70s, which is a little... I was 10 and 11 when this story takes place, so the kid's a little older than I was, really. It didn't really help with relating to the kid and improve relationship, but at least it got me writing a story. And then a few months into the writing, in October, Lou died. October 2013. October 29th, I believe, 2013. And that hit me pretty hard, I had gotten to know him, be friendly with him the last decade or so of his life, and he was a real hero of mine for a long time, from particularly in my 20s and after. So as a New Yorker, as a friend, as a artist, and as a fan, it was. I mean, that epilogue is kind of, there's the only things that are really biographical. That I was on the highway and Pale Blue Eyes came on. It was 3 days after he died. I was driving. I was living in Santa Barbara, California at that time. That's where I wrote the book. For about 7 or 8 years, I lived out there. And it came on the radio, and I just lost it. I mean, it was just like I was alone driving, and that song is so beautiful and quiet and delicate and sensitive. And and then right after that, Blue Mask came on, which is such a contradiction or whatever. And then I had the idea of putting Lou in the story. The kid moves into New York. That was always a story. From Queens to New York, it's a, 20-minute subway ride, but it's a completely different world. And he's living in this building, and Lou's living there. And that was really how it started.
Your use of Lou Reed in the book is like really fascinating because, you render him, as extremely complicated and difficult, but also as kind of warm and loving as he was. But, I think for most people, like to imagine him as this kind of guidepost or, maybe even paternal figure, is kind of counterintuitive. Could you talk about like working through some of that?
Yeah. Well, in the book, he's definitely a reluctant father figure. The kid, at the beginning of the story, the reason why he moves from Queens, his mother inherits some money from her father, the kid's grandfather, who was like a bookie. He owned a grocery store. And the kid's father had left the mother and went out to California. So in a very short period of time, the kid loses and his grandfather was a big paternal presence in the family, loses his two main, father figures. So there's Lou, who's, on these speed binges and living with a transgender woman. And to this kid, even though to society, especially at the time, this is a very, on the, outrageous kind of lifestyle. To the kid, he kind of sees normality in it almost, or acceptance and inspiration. So to me, really, the story, more so than a coming of age or a story, it's kind of passing the baton of artistic inspiration. So it's like the lineage of artistic inspiration. So Lou's almost more like a shaman, like artistic figure passing on inspiration, which is kind of what he was for me. And I realized in the writing of it, it's really the first time I finally met Lou. I had seen him because I lived in the Village in the 80s and 90s. I'm in my 20s, and he was there at the time. And I would see him walking around the neighborhood, which is kind of bizarre, being a kid, in your 20s, and your heroes are like, I would see Allen Ginsberg, and that you grew up in the Village. It's pretty wild. So I never approached him, but I would see him around. So one day I was at the Knicks game. I was at Madison Square Garden, and I see Lou Reed. And I had just been cast in a movie called I Shot Andy Warhol, which was an indie movie made in like the mid-90s, I think, or late 90s. And I was cast as Ondine, who was a friend of Lou's. So I'm like, this is great. I have an icebreaker. I can go up to him and say this. The only problem was he was furious that they were making this movie about Valerie Solanas, who was this, insane person who almost killed his best friend, basically. But I was like, well, it's a movie. So I went up to her. I said, hi, I'm a big fan. We were on the escalator, going up. I'm a big fan of yours. I'm an actor. I just got cast in this movie. I Shot Andy Warhol. I said, I know you're not too happy about the fact they're making. He went, I think it's despicable they're making a movie about that psychotic bitch. I was like, yeah, I know. I know. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
But I'm playing Ondine. And he went, good luck. And then turned away and stepped away from there. And I just was like, I felt like just such a fool, And then like a beat or two later, he looks over his shoulder and he goes like this. So I like worked my way up the escalator, and he puts his arm around me. He goes, listen, work hard, do a good job, and just remember he was very, very funny. And that was it. So there was that, what you brought up, Lou could be a very acerbic, nasty guy. But yet there was, and then years later when I finally met him under different circumstances, he was very warm and affectionate, and he was a very, very sensitive person.
Extremely so.
Yeah. Obviously, to be an artist of that caliber, you have to. But day-to-day wise and as a person, but he could also be very, especially, when he was up for 3 days doing Disoxin and, which was an amphetamine that they give to like people who have heart attacks, basically. He was using that kind of recreationally for days on end. So that would, I'm sure, exacerbate all that kind of, nastiness.
One of the things that I actually wrote a biography of Lou Reed, and
he's one of the very few journalists, maybe the only, that Lou actually liked. I have to say that about Anthony because Lou was notorious for despising rock journalists. He just
absolutely,
yeah, and he really liked Anthony. So
we brought Lou down here one time, which was a whole. I mean, I could take the next 20 minutes going through what that involved, down to the last minute of, when he had agreed to come down, months before. And then like the day before, it was just, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. And I was like, Lou, come on, man. You said you were going to do it. And he goes, oh, you're going to get your nose out of joint. Maybe we just forget about the whole thing. And I don't even remember how we got off the phone. Like what I said to kind of round things off. He wasn't that kind of person. But I came down here thinking, well, he'll show up or he won't show up. What can you do? And when he got here, he came and he was like nothing had happened. Anthony, oh God, it's so great to see you. This is going to be great, And he was going crazy over this prosciutto that we had ordered, and he was just like eating it because I need the name of the place where you got this, Like it was just spectacular. But one of the revelations of the book for me was really learning about the depth of his relationship with Rachel, the trans woman that he was involved with. It was, I mean, I knew about it and, everybody knew about it. Lou made no effort whatsoever to conceal it, and, but it was something that people was just, oh, Lou, what a wild guy, and this is in the 70s, meanwhile. But I really came to understand, I feel, the depth of their connection and how real it was, and what a sad thing it was when they split up. And now obviously Rachel is a figure in the book as well, and that relationship is a factor in the book as well. I wonder if you could talk about that aspect of Lou and writing about that.
Yeah, when I learned about his relationship with her, I found it, fascinating that Lou is a major rock star. This is the mid-70s, 76, 5, 6, 7. Living very open. I mean, he was photographed with her. She's on album covers with him. She was on stage with him. I mean, there was no effort to hide that. Yet he didn't do a lot of speaking about, publicly about like,
Well, he never would talk about really any of his relationships.
Yeah, he was very private about it, very public about it, which I felt for the time was very, first of all, very brave, right? Not giving a shit what anybody thought, And it hadn't been talked about a lot. Like when I started the book, it was actually finding information wasn't as easy as it suddenly became the last few years. I just found it made me admire him a lot more, that he was that true to himself, that he was that brave and unafraid about what society thought. And, listen, when people are using that kind of drugs, the amount of drugs that he probably used and those kind of things, it brings out a lot of bad behavior. And I think that relationship brought out some bad behavior. And I don't go into that because it's not a book about their relationship, I'm really trying to keep it from the kid's point of view, which is specific to a period of time and specific to the kid's situation. But one thing that has come out of it, I mean, I was just telling Anthony that we're working on creating a scholarship. It's not it's going to be announced soon, but I'm not going to say too much about it. In her name, because she wound up going to a men's prison in the 80s and contracted AIDS and died of AIDS, and it'll be a scholarship for a master's program in art and public policy, and in her name, to as a reminder of what should never be allowed to happen again. So that's well, I applaud that too because it's a good thing. I won't give too many details till we formally announce, or I won't say where it's happening, but it's in the works and will probably happen this year. So, and I think a good way to, to tell her story, really. I'm sure all of you know what it probably was like for transgender people back in those days. It's not that it's particularly easy today, with laws being passed, and legislation in states against their rights and stuff like that. So, so all that moved me a lot. His story, her story moved me in this world, and I like stories about artists, like famous people or artists or historical people that take a very kind of little slice. I think biopics often, like movies especially, or they usually fail because they try to tell the whole story. Especially in rock and roll, because the stories are almost always the same, right? They start off, they're doing great, they start doing good, and they start doing a lot of drugs, and then they, and everyone rips them off, and then they fall down, and then they get clean and meet somebody really nice, and then kind of get a revival of their career in Las Vegas or wherever. But so that was in my mind. There's a great film that has always stuck with me. You might know this film, The Hours and the Times. Do you know that one?
No.
The Hours and the Times is a strange film because it's only like an hour. And I can't remember the director's name. If someone wants to Google his name, that would be really helpful because he deserves a mention here. But it's about a weekend that Brian Epstein and John Lennon spent in Barcelona, right before the band went super galactic. They were big in England and, starting to get on the charts in England, but it was right before they before they went to America. And it's really interesting because it's such a great way to tell a John Lennon story, a Beatles story from this when the acting's great. And it's just that little slice of their lives. And it's really, you would love it. You got to see it. I don't even know where it's playing. Anyone find out the name? Christopher Munch, yeah, or Munk, however you pronounce it in German. It's a really good one.
What obviously, we were talking about the variety of we are at the writer's house, and you have done such a variety of writing. I mean, you wrote this novel, you write songs, you've done screenplays, and you wrote some of the episodes of The Sopranos, and talk about the different kinds of writing that you do, what it calls on, and also, I mean, maybe this is a kind of glib question, but like how do if you have an idea, like, do you know that, well, okay, this is a song or this is going to be something else?
I think you'd know the medium before you start. I do, at least. The more personal things, like The Sopranos, I mean, there's personal elements to it, but it's a real collaboration because it's you're writing for a show that the template's already been set and all that. But the first thing,
how would it be determined? Like, okay, you're going to write this episode. How would that happen?
Well, the first one I wrote as a spec between season 1 and season 2, and then we made that, and then after that, it was the writers would meet before the season and break stories, and outline stuff together often, and then you'd assign an episode to one or the other, depending on the schedule. The first thing that I wrote that ever got made was The Summer of Sam, which was Spike Lee's movie that I wrote with a partner, and we brought it to Spike. Originally, I wanted to direct it, and Spike was going to produce it, but we couldn't get a deal. So then Spike decided he wanted to make it. And that, because I had a cousin who was, the stories about this paranoia that happens when this serial killer is killing people in New York. And people started really getting paranoid about their neighbors. Like, because he stayed in kind of specific areas, and people were thinking, the press was and the cops were saying it's probably a loner, some guy who lives by himself, maybe a vet or an ex-con, or somebody weird, so people started looking at their neighbors. And I had a cousin who was beaten almost to death in Mount Vernon, New York, which is right near like the Bronx, the next town from where this killer lived, actually. For some reason, the people he knew thought he was the killer, whatever. He fit some profile. I don't even know exactly what happened, but that also happened in the Bronx, in my friend's neighborhood. So he had this idea. We started writing this screenplay together. But a lot of that is about, and so is the book in a lot of ways, kind of being an outsider, being an outsider and not being understood. Being kind of treated a certain way because you're different, feeling isolated, feeling alienated from a lot of the world that you're living in. That's kind of a recurring theme, I think, even in some of the songs. And the songs, most of the songs in the band, I play in a band called Zopa. It's a trio. Most of the lyrics... I write most of the lyrics, not all of them, but there's some elements of that in some of the lyrics, not all.
If we could talk about The Sopranos for a second, it's too late for spoilers. With The Sopranos, just deal with it. But the murder of Christopher was, to me, one of the most incredibly, kind of ravaging, emotionally devastating scenes, that I recall in almost, anything that I've ever seen. And I wonder, if you could, just talk about doing that,
Doing those kind of things is really not what you think, because it's very technical. Like, violence on screen is very technical. You're doing it for the camera and all those things. And I don't know. Oddly enough, it wasn't like the big deal that day was if you've seen that scene, there's an SUV that we're driving that goes off the side of the road and flips like 5 times. There was a guy who did that stunt who was in that SUV and rolled down this hill like 4 or 5 times. That was impressive. But I don't know. It wasn't. I was happy that the character basically lasted to the end of the series, because there was only a couple of shows after that. But I thought it was a great way to end their relationship, I guess, if you want to put it that way. It really showed how far both characters came, but especially Tony Soprano's character, how far this guy, where his world was by then, where he's murdering his, kind of quasi-relative, but this kid who was, looked up to him as a father figure again in a lot of ways, and just was like to the, his self-preservation instincts got to the point where he felt he had to eliminate his nephew. Very Shakespearean, right?
Who comes up a fair amount in your own work. Your sort of references in song titles, even in lyrics,
Yeah, although I haven't read that much Shakespeare. I wish I could say. I was an expert on it, but no, not too much. But I like it
because that's something Lou would always refer to as well. I mean,
yeah,
Lou Reed.
he loved. Well, the title, right? The title of the book is from Lou's song "Romeo Had Juliet," and that's one of the perfume burned his eyes, holding tightly to her thighs, and something flickered for a minute, and then it vanished and was gone, which I always thought was a lovely lyric. It always stuck with me, and then finally I found something that I could do with it, even though it wasn't mine. But that little stanza always stuck with me. I thought, wow, he was a tremendous writer. He really was.
One of the one of the other aspects of The Sopranos is the use of music in The Sopranos, which I remember. I hope I remember this right because I haven't seen it since I saw it. But I thought that like that. Did they use the Van Morrison version of "Comfortably Numb" when during that murder?
They did, yeah.
Yeah, and it was like so powerful.
Yeah.
I don't obviously you know a lot about music, but I know also there are people who control the music in shows like that. But can you talk about like the function of music in in The Sopranos?
Well, the creator, David Chase, was a musician when he was like in high school. He was a drummer and a huge music fan. Particularly like English bands from the 60s, like the Kinks. The Stones was his. That was his. I think he was at Altamont, David.
Wow.
And loved the, all those English bands from the 60s. So music was something very important to him. I mean, and one of the things that really set The Sopranos apart from TV at the time was, it was, you would see what you would go to the movies for really on TV, and there was a cinematic element that he wanted to bring, and music was a part of that, having, not score it. There's no score. The music is
Right.
the score, right? They didn't hire a composer to do a theme and a score, and it was pretty much rock and roll. I mean, not exclusively, but, predominantly. From, the 50s to, a lot of currently, and they'd get, when the show took off, they get lots and lots of submissions all the time. Like there was a music supervisor. David had a lot of ideas, David Chase, about music, but there was a music supervisor who, that was his job, finding music, license, getting the license, getting the deals and all that stuff. But once the show really was a hit, lots of young indie bands and, were submitting, their CDs to the production to get heard. And some of them made it to the soundtrack.
One of the reasons, the way I'd heard about The Sopranos, but it was like anything. Like you're just like now, like watch this show. Like immediately, I start thinking, how many episodes is that? Is that do I devote 40 hours of my life to this thing or whatever? But when The Sopranos was happening, and there was a kind of a buzz about it, I went to see the band, the Black Crowes, actually, and at a sort of like little party afterwards, Steve Van Zandt was there, and we were talking, and he was in it. He's in The Sopranos, obviously, and he goes, "Oh, I'm acting," and I said, "Oh, yeah, I heard," and he goes, "Yeah, I'm in this." He goes, "Have you seen it?" And I said, "No." He goes, "Look, you have to see it." He goes, it was really like such an impassioned, like, I'm not just hyping myself or my current project. He goes, it is really good and it's very distinctive, And I thought, okay. And then that was, the end of that.
Well, Stephen Van Zandt, oddly enough, was one of the finalists to play Tony Soprano.
Wow.
So David Chase saw Stephen Van Zandt induct the Rascals at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony. It was something about the speech, which was very funny. Stephen Van Zandt's a very funny guy and very smart and witty. And
for those of you who don't know the Young Rascals, like, they used to wear, like, they were dressed like the Young Rascals on TV, or, they wore like, flowy shirts and, shorts and all that. And when Steve inducted the Young Rascals into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, that he wore that one of those outfits,
Right.
and gave a very good speech.
That's right. And they were from New Jersey, and Steve Van Zandt plays in the Bruce Springsteen E Street Band, which I'm sure most of you know. But so he saw this speech. He's like, that guy should be an actor. He'd be great for this thing. I don't know on what stage of the writing The Sopranos was, but when I went to, I auditioned in New York for David Chase, and then they had the screen test at HBO in LA. And in the waiting room was James Gandolfini, a guy named Michael Rispoli, who played Jackie Aprile, the mob boss in the first season, and Steven Van Zandt, the three of them reading for Tony Soprano.
Amazing. Well, we're going to open the floor to questions in just a minute. I just wanted to touch on, the White Lotus, your most recent, gambit. That second season was just terrific, I thought. And, could you talk about just how that came up? And, obviously it was set in Sicily, so you had a nice, interesting experience there, I'm sure.
Yeah, that spoiled me. That's bad. I wish I was still in Sicily. I came about, the casting person on The White Lotus was the assistant to the casting people on The Sopranos. And she did, my wife and I had a theater in New York in like 2003 for a number of years. And she did some casting with us at the theater. And then I directed an independent movie, and she did some casting on that movie. So she knew me, obviously. And the producer of The White Lotus was Locations, and then I think maybe co-producer at some point on The Sopranos. So one of them probably put the bug in Mike White's ear that they should see me. But I had to audition on tape because a lot of people weren't doing auditions because of COVID, and it's kind of stayed that way, which is not so fun, really, doing it self-tape at home, But I hadn't seen season 1, and I didn't watch it. I just did the audition. They just gave me a couple of scenes.
Yeah.
They just gave me, I didn't get all the scripts. I just had like 3 scenes from the character I played, right? But I didn't see the show. I heard it was good, but I was shooting something else, and I was like, well, let me just do it. And then before sending it in, I gave it to my managers, and they said, you need to watch season 1. I'm like, well, I said, why? Did I suck? I mean, what do you mean? Like, no, you need to watch it. You gotta, you didn't really get the tone. So I watched it, and I really liked it. I thought, at first I'm watching, I'm like, is this going to be some cynical thing that rich people suck and white people suck and the world sucks and everybody's, that's what I was like, low hanging fruit, and then I watched it and I was like, no, wow, because he really, I thought really saw all these people, a lot of them were doing horrible things, but with a lot of humanity, and a lot of humor that wasn't necessarily in the scenes that I had to audition with. So then I went back, and I couldn't stop watching. I thought it was so good, and I called Steve Zahn, who was in season 1, is someone I've worked with before, and he said, you have to do this. He said, you're going to love Mike. He loves actors and whatever. So I did another audition, the same scenes, sent it in. They said, okay, we'll send these in, and then got the role. That's how that happened.
Well, look, why don't we open the floor to questions? And we're going to be passing around to Mike so that, because, we want to get your question as well. So right here in the front.
Okay, thank you for coming. And just a quick question. So Penn is kind of a very, I guess, professional environment, like a lot of drive to enter the field of business or consulting, and wanting to do something more creative is kind of less common and I guess harder to get into. So what advice do you have for students and future graduates who want to enter the creative sector, but at a time when it's kind of more precarious and harder to do so?
Honestly, I think it's always been hard and precarious to do anything creative. To be honest, I think it's easier now because when I'm 57 next month, right? When I started pursuing acting was 1983, because I started mostly as an actor. Started playing music not long after that, but the idea of shooting your own movie really wasn't a thing, right? Video cameras weren't even that popular, making movies on video. So like nowadays, you can make a movie, you can put it on YouTube, you can put it on Amazon if you want, I guess, as I know people who've done that with independent movies. You can promote it through social media. You can access people who have an interest in the same things you do through social media. So it's so different. And then think of music, right? Music used to have to be recorded in a studio with giant, tape, and really expensive and really, really hard. People have little studios in their house. People who don't even have necessarily a lot of money, and then distributing it same way. You have social media. There's digital streaming things. So, even like self-publishing books, if that's where you're at. There's so many different ways and to do that, to put not only the creative tools of the medium, but the tools of distribution. So I think it just takes a little bit of, the best thing is always to think out of the box a little bit. But, if any of this kind of thing calls to you, it has to call to you enough where you have to do it. And if that's the case, then you should. If it's not the case, and you're not sure if you want to, because it can be very hard. It could be a struggle, of course. You may have to work other jobs that maybe you're not crazy about in the meantime before you start making a living. But if that's your burning desire, that's what you have to do. Doesn't mean if you want to do some things for fun, you can, do you want to play music for fun? Why not? Maybe it'll stimulate your creativity and you'll decide to really join a band and tour and make albums. But I would not be discouraged by the state of things, because it's always hard, but you have to make that decision on if you want to go all in, if you're okay doing community theater, which is cool. A lot of people do and have fun because they like that, but they like also the stability of having a normal job or whatever that means, a steady income. Then, health benefits is always nice because we don't have them, universally here in this country. So,
if I can add something, I think, teaching in the writing program here and working with kids often have, similar concerns to yours. I think at Penn it's particularly difficult because, kind of Wharton is such a sort of predominant presence, and, but you have to kind of shut out the kind of expectations, and, you find the people and the places on campus that resonate with you, and, so that, if you're thinking like, oh my God, so-and-so's going out and they're getting a job and they're going to make $250,000. Well, you're not going to be an actor, or you're not going to be a musician, that's unlikely to happen that fast. But if you're talking, if you're hanging around with your friends who are doing similar things and you're finding your places, even in Philadelphia, more generally outside this place, there's stuff going on, and you look to that, stuff, and you set your own standard, for what you're doing. I always used to, when I was trying to get going as a writer, I used to use I had this term that I used, like the fun, money, prestige index. It was like, well, writing this piece it's not a big payday, but it's in a good place. And I could then say, oh, I wrote for that place. Or, something else was maybe not that prestigious, but, I actually made some money and it would free me to do some other things, so, but if I were worried or if I was concerned or paid too much attention to, my other friends who were doing other kinds of work that was where there was a much steadier kind of path, that would have been too depressing. I tried to keep the focus on, I can't keep the standard internal, keep the focus internal, but also try to find the people who, I could relate to and were trying to do things like what I was trying to do. Anyone else? Oh, we've got lots of questions. Okay. This person with the green shirt on, you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming in today. It's really great talk. I was wondering about your writing process, specifically how you write in multiple media. So would you say that your experience writing for screenplays has affected the way you have approached this novel? Did you break it down in an act structure? Or what's the overlap in skill set in the different things that you're writing?
I think as you work, if you're writing, say you're going to write screenplay, novel, teleplay, whatever, as you go, everything affects everything, right? It's the part of the learning process and seeing how you can succeed and where the juice is for you and stuff. Novel, I didn't have an outline. Like most novelists that I know and spoke to or even read about, most of them don't outline. There's a great novelist, Paul Auster, some of you I'm sure know, who said, you just start off with little bits and then constellations start to form, which I thought was a really great metaphor. You start with an idea obviously has to grab a character, a moment in time. For me, it was this kid moving from Queens to Manhattan in the 70s. That was juicy enough for me to start. I've had attempts at fiction where the idea had some juice, but either at some point the juice dried up. It wasn't enough to really, get a complete story. The process for fiction writing for me is you have to have a long stretch of time where you're doing daily work. And mornings for me were best. Especially setting aside a chunk of time where even if you're not hitting the keyboard, that time when you sit at that desk, that's your writing time. So sometimes it's just processing, your imagination working, but knowing that time is dedicated to that is really important, I think. Because there were days where it wasn't happening, but it was on another level. Because if you consider yourself a writer, which if that's what you want to do, you should consider yourself that. That's important that you say, well, I'm not that I'm going to try, that I'm a writer. Because when you do that, you have to honor the imagination and the mind, meaning any idea that comes in relation to this subject matter, you have to write down and you have to look into it because there's no random thoughts anymore. Once you've tuned yourself to this story or this character or this moment, your writer's imagination has been tuned to that frequency. Whatever thought might seem really random and really silly, it might be you might have a dream and wake up from it. Write it down. Do not, because you'll forget it. Write it down and honor it and look at it because your mind is, your imagination is, that's where it's come from and that's where you're going to get the information. And one of the most gratifying things about fiction writing, I found, not having an outline, right? Because the other stuff, mostly screenplays and teleplays, you work from an outline. Is surprising yourself where all of a sudden you have an impulse to take the story somewhere else. Or a line of dialogue comes that strikes you as really funny that just, it comes purely from the imagination. What a beautiful thing. Screenplays, teleplays, especially teleplays, a more condensed time-wise process, so there's a little bit different approach. you're working from an outline for the most of the time. Not always for original screenplays. I don't know. Does that answer you a little bit?
Yeah. Also, like when you said like you put some time in the morning for you to sit down and write.
Mornings, I mean, it start in the morning, like
Right.
2, 3, 4 or 5 hours. After that, for me, it's like the law of diminishing returns, kind of.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you're choosing to work on a screenplay or teleplay instead, do you also like say this is my writing time, or do you do it slightly?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I try to do that. I'm writing something now, a screenplay, and I work in a library near my house. I like getting out of the house because the house has so many distractions and reminders of like your day-to-day mundane life. That's not, you know what I mean? It's just like, it's so easy to go to the fridge. It's easy to get, oh, here's that bill I got to pay or whatever. The library, it's where I work, there's a bunch of different rooms where you can go and stuff. And it's just, you have to be quiet. Obviously, you can't talk on your phone. And there's that meditative, literary thing that just happens there. So,
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, in the back. You, sir. Yeah, good. Standing up there. Well, wait, we need to get you a mic.
Yeah, you were fantastic on The Sopranos,
Thank
and I'm
you.
just curious if you learned or gleaned anything from James Gandolfini during your time there, whether it be like an acting tip or something that he did in his routine. We're very sad to not have him anymore, but if what sort of acting things did you learn from him?
What was good about him was he wasn't afraid to make a fool of himself, which I think I was. More than he was. It's funny because Jim and I on the show, our ages were a lot farther apart in the show. In real life, our ages were much closer together. He was only like 4 or 5 years, like 5 years older than me in real life. He just at that time looked older than me. I looked young as opposed to now. But and we were both, when we started that, in very similar places in our career. We had both done some movies and some, theater, and some people knew about us. So it was never like a mentor kind of relationship. It was much more just peers and friends. We were really good friends. We, hung out a lot. But what I did learn, he would do, he'd get to the set and like start making like elephant noises because he was fat, or he considered himself fat, and he liked to like make a joke about that. I don't know. I mean, he was very self-deprecating, and so he'd make these elephant noises because he was, he considered himself overweight. It's his way of just saying, "Here I am. I'm not gonna. I don't care. Whatever you think of me, here I am walking in my underwear, with my gut hanging out, and I don't give a shit, and I'm gonna do my thing, and that there's something, because you got to be free as an actor, He also was just very, very generous and treated the crew. He was like the captain of the team, because he was there more than anybody else. He was on set working more than any of the other actors by far. And he had a lot of respect and looked out for the crew. Was concerned about their well-being in a very genuine way. He was a very generous guy too. So, and those things are important, especially if you're the lead on a show. You set the tone a lot, and that's important, for morale and for people's spirits, because it's hard work. It's long, long days, and it goes on and on and on for months, and so often you're outside and it's cold and winter and snow and whatever, and all night long sometimes. And, having somebody who's became really famous and is still working on the show and making a lot of money, but being very human and very kind I think was important to us.
This gentleman up front.
Going back to
Whoa.
pardon me. The title of the book. Could you speak about the possible ramifications of that title whose perfume, whose eyes, on how many levels might that refer?
Well, a lot. The song Romeo Had Juliet is a New York romantic love story, obviously. Like, how does it start? Caught between the twisted stars, the plotted lines, the faulty map that brought Columbus to New York. Columbus never made it to New York, but I never really put that together till years later. Every time I heard that song, I'm like, Columbus came to New York. And then you're like, wait a second. Yeah. So immediately the geography of it is set, and there's something about youth that I always loved about it. The perfume burned his eyes could be, in this case, sexuality at the age, the degree of sexuality the kid got involved at that age was too much. I think there's an element of that kind of star-crossed lovers in the book, both from the kid and a girl that he's involved with, and Lou and Rachel at the same time. What happens in the book is the kid loses his two father figures, right? Now he's hanging out with Lou Reed. And in this span of time, he does drugs for the first time. He has sex for the first time. He gets a job for the first time. He drives a car for the first time. He goes to a bar for the first. All the kind of totems, the tropes of manhood he experiences in this period under the tutelage of this crazy rock star. So there's something about loss of innocence as well that I don't even know if that's what he's really talking about in the song, but that I always gleaned from it. The perfume burned his eyes, holding tightly to her thighs, and something flickered for a minute in his mind, right? And then it vanished and was gone. What flickered, right? Some idea of like perfect love, a future, children, maybe not, I don't know. Someone else, a man instead of a woman, maybe, I love the ambiguity of it too. It's beautiful.
Yes, so do I. May I be permitted another fast question? Anthony, no, I'll wait.
We need to, unfortunately. I would like to do one more, and then maybe, would you mind reading for another little bit?
I could, yeah. Yeah, I could.
Thank you so much. You've spoken a little bit about your collaborative process, but what are some of the challenges in trying to blend your voice with another writer? And are there any collaborative projects you are working at this moment?
Yeah, collaboration is hard. Most of the people I collaborated in the past, I'm no longer friends with. That's how hard it is. That's true.
That's excellent.
But that was also a little bit when I was a little more green, and expectations were a little unrealistic on both sides of the partnership. Doing it with Sopranos, that's a collaboration, right? Because they're not your characters. Well, maybe you may introduce a new character in your script, but for the most part, they're not yours. And that's a little bit easier in terms of the relationships because you go off and write it yourself, basically. Collaborations are tricky because you're really trying to get this subjective point of view across, and you really have to both parties really have to understand what you're going for. Yeah, I'm collaborating on two things. One is a pilot for HBO where I play myself. It's about the guy I'm working with wrote on Curb Your Enthusiasm. It's a little dark. It's actually a lot darker. It's a dark comedy, but it's about Buddhism and celebrity, I guess, or culture. It's a dark comedy though, and the guy I'm working with, his name is Alec Berg, who's a showrunner of a show called Barry on HBO.
Oh Jesus! Yeah,
And,
that's great.
We're on our second draft now, but HBO bought the pitch. I mean, whether or not they'll actually make it depends on how the next draft goes, probably. But I like working with him. You know, it's good if you can figure out what your skills are. Like, he's really good at knowing how a pilot works or a pitch, because we pitched it together. How does a pitch work? As he said, the pitch is the commercial for the pilot, and the pilot's the commercial for the show, which was good for me because I've pitched a lot of stuff in the past, but that really made sense. Knowing what, you know, I'm bringing, I mean, he's not a Buddhist, I am, so I bring that kind of knowledge. I'm playing myself, so certain things that he's not privy to that I'm bringing. But he's also really, really, really funny in a way that works for like a half-hour dark comedy, and really smart about stakes and structure and things like that. And then I'm writing a screenplay with David Chase that was initially his idea. So when it's somebody's initial idea, you have to give a little deference because, see, like with this thing, he's got to give some deference to me because I have a certain responsibility to Buddhism in general. Like I can portray things about it humorously, satirical even, but I also have to honor it. It can't be a cynical thing about religion. There's, you know, because I find that to be, you know, something meaningful. So I have to, but I don't want it to be too earnest or like, you know, some kind of propaganda thing. Finding that. So he understands that. So I think if you can find out what those strengths and weaknesses or positions are, it makes it a little bit easier. When they're not clearly defined, is room for trouble.
Well, Michael, this was all fantastic, and I wonder, if you could do a little reading, and but remind you all, please buy a copy of Michael's book, and also, come and hang a bit for the reception.
All right, I'm gonna shorten this section just because I don't want to. Let me see. Okay, that's where I'll stop. Okay, so basically, both Lou and Matthew, the boy's name is Matthew, and Lou calls him Tim through the whole thing, just kind of mistakenly thinks that that's his name, and the kid doesn't correct him. They both broke up with their loves, basically. And the kid is kind of distraught and wants to go see Lou, because his mother's kind of checked out, and he doesn't really have such a close relationship with us. Lou's almost at this point like his only friend, really. I heard the music before I got to his door. It was open just a sliver, so I pushed it a little wider. He was on the rug playing an acoustic guitar. I had never seen him with anything but an electric. He played a very simple riff over and over again. 2 chords. It was hypnotic, concentrated, and sad. And so was he. He didn't notice me for about 30 seconds because his head was bent and cocked at an odd angle down toward the gaping orifice of the instrument. There was a photograph and a red tank top at his feet. He may have been staring at either one of them, or both. A bottle of Johnny Walker Black sat a little to his right. He looked up and saw me in the doorway. He didn't stop what he was doing, but gave enough of a nod to say I was welcome to come in. I didn't want to interrupt him, but I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay inside of that moment with him, inside the quiet. It felt right. It almost felt good. I sat on the floor across from him. I didn't feel like a guest. I belonged there. It was mine as much as his that day. I'm composing a symphony, Tim. It's something I think I will be very proud of. He kept on strumming the 2 chords of his song. It was sparse, stark, and bare, but I'm sure he was hearing much, much more than what was coming out of his guitar. It's a symphonic suite, very formal and structured with scrupulous discipline. I'm putting everything I have into this one. everything I have and everything I can get, the New York Philharmonic Strings, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. No, fuck the Mormons. I'd rather the Vienna Boys. He glanced at me. And I want the middle part to sound like the last day of heaven. Celestial voices, violins, and cellos. I love the cello. The cello is the musical instrument that resembles the human voice more than any other. He stared at the photo. As my eyes got used to the room's dim light, I could see it was a picture of him and Rachel. He was sitting on her lap, and her arms were wrapped around him in a very protective way. She was wearing the same red tank top that was on the floor in front of him. Tim, me boy, this will be the first rock song to change water into wine, feed the multitudes, and raise the dead from their tombs. The last statement made him chuckle. And as the middle part hits its coda, God reaches down with his purple and his finger and grabs Adam right by the apple. And then the words start coming. And now I'm the coldest motherfucker ever walked a block in Harlem mid-December. Bobby Sledge, a.k.a. Bobby Rikers, carried a straight razor in his boot. Every time he went to the toilet, he dipped the blade into the bowl before he flushed whatever it was that came out of him. So the blade was constantly contaminated with all kinds of breeding bacteria, amoebas and parasites and boogeymen. Woe unto she who got a bit of Bobby's blade. Lou stopped playing the guitar, took a big swig of scotch and lit a cigarette. He coughed 5 or 6 times after the first long drag and hacked up something nasty into a tissue. Then he stuck the smoking ciggy back into his mouth and resumed his riff. And Bobby is going to just tell the truth, man, right in the middle of the fucking church. He's going to lay out all the cold, heartless, pitiless reality of this gutter we call life on earth. Another pause in the music as he took a long pull on his cigarette. And then, just as sudden as it started, it changes. Bang! And now it's 1957, and we're on a street corner in the Bronx in the middle of the night, and Dion and the Belmonts is serenading all our sisters and our mothers and our lovers. Shit, maybe I'll ask Dion to do it himself. Sing a few bars or a chorus. That would be very cool. You like Dion, Tim? I like The Wanderer. This made Lou laugh. You got good taste, kid. Maybe I'll get you instead of Dion. He stopped talking and kept playing for a long time. It seemed like it would go on this way forever. Then he started singing. Love has gone away and there's no one here now. He repeated these lines over and over. I'd never heard his voice sound that way before. It was a delicate, fragile, wounded voice, and it echoed off the thick white of the walls. Then he added, took the rings off my fingers. The last phrase broke him. He kept strumming, but stopped singing. He didn't cry or sob audibly, but the tears fell on his hands and strings. I reached for his cigarettes without asking. It was both deliberate and unconscious, and I had never done it before. He caught me out of the corner of his eye, but didn't question my being so bold. I think it pleased him, though his face was so full of misery I couldn't say for sure. The fight and ferocity had left him. So had the cruelty and viciousness he could access in an instant. The child was in his eyes. I felt like his older brother. The 3 silver rings he wore on his fingers were gone, and so was Rachel. I didn't have to ask. The song was proof beyond a reasonable doubt. She was gone, and he would be too. I couldn't imagine him remaining in the home they shared. I don't think he liked being alone, yet there weren't many people he liked being with. Knowing this made me feel special. He changed the rhythm of the song. The pace quickened, and he started singing again. There was a new tension in his voice as he repeated the phrases about his lost love. After several refrains, he began to chant, "Come on and slip away." I wasn't sure what that meant. Did it mean to die? Did it mean to withdraw from the world and all its heartbreak and violence? Did it mean to get as high, as numb, as anesthetized as possible? He stopped the song. It was abrupt, like the needle being yanked off a record. His hands and arms went slack over the guitar like he was cradling it, like he was shielding it from all the evil in the world. He lifted his head. The tears stopped. I had a strong desire to talk to him about Veronica, but I knew I couldn't. Not because this was a bad time. I just felt in my bones that it wasn't in the cards, and I'd never be able to bring it up with him.
Michael Imperioli.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for coming today.
And Anthony DeCurtis. Thank you, Anthony, for another
Thanks
amazing
very much. Thank
hosting.
you.
We want to ask you if you buy a book, ask Michael to inscribe it, that you form a line on this side of the room. And as Anthony said, we have a lot of food and drink. Please hang out for a while. Let's thank Michael one more time for joining us tonight.
Caught between the twisted stars, the plotted lines, the faulty map that brought Columbus to New York. Between the east and west, he calls on her wearing a leather vest. The earth squeals and shudders to a halt. A diamond crucifix in his ear is used to help ward off the fear that he has left his soul in someone's rented car.